Swamiji often weaves together so many different thoughts, even after listening to these readings for 30 years, more than that. Sometimes I would read them and just wonder what he was trying to get across. Swamiji doesn't write rationally. He's the author of those readings, the reading on the scripture that we just heard for those who might not know. Kriyananda, the founder of Ananda. He doesn't write rationally, and he didn't write those readings by outlining ideas. His way of writing always was intuitive. He would just feel what Master wanted him to say, and then often the flow of ideas, as he himself would say, would surprise him. And only later would the structure of it be revealed. That's in fact, although Swamiji elevated that art to a very high level, anyone who does intuitive work, artistic, creative work, whether writing, painting, singing, anything, with a level of attunement, often finds that one doesn't really know what one has created until after one has created it, because there's a certain absence of ego involvement and a certain simply flowing with what's coming and a divine trust in that. That's a whole subject in itself. But what I was struck by this time reading it, because every time I've seen this, there's the part about Jesus' disciples and being there with him at the Garden of Gethsemane, him asking them to pray, and they're being unable to stay awake. And then Swami throws in the line how bitterly they must have regretted that. I mean, they had no idea what was about to happen. It was just late at night after a long day, and they just weren't able to stay up all night. I mean, it's something that any of us could easily imagine. I remember when Swamiji, when I was in my 20s, and I was working closely with Swamiji, and often day after day, I would come over in the late afternoon, and we would often, I and several others would often be with him until late at night, sometimes into the early morning hours. And jokingly, years later, he commented on the look of what he called desperate fatigue that he would often see in my eyes, which I don't remember clearly, but I take his word for it. He was expanding our energy. He was asking more of us. I do remember being with him once when we were in India, and we had all just come from America, and I was terribly jet-lagged. And we went off to visit some old friends of his, Indu and Rani Ban. It was really a big thing to be over there. And I remember literally passing out and having to just get up from the tea table and crawl behind the couch and just stretch out. I mean, there was just nothing I could do. There was no way I could keep myself awake. I was in this, this great historic moment of reunion between Swami and old friends. I mean, everything in me wanted to be awake. And I just went, whoa, like that. It just couldn't be done. Now, the purpose of Swamiji including this is because the discussion is the difference between human and divine will. And even though I've read it many times, I never actually quite got that was the point, which is even with the best of intentions, as he writes in there, sometimes it works out for us and sometimes it doesn't. Human will sometimes brings success, sometimes brings catastrophe. Now, the confusion when we try to sort this out is that sometimes divine will brings success and sometimes divine will brings catastrophe if we're just watching things on the basis of the very short-term view. I had many experiences with Swamiji which gradually helped me to understand that, let me phrase it slightly differently. I followed the policy in my many years of being with Swamiji, which was the same policy that he said he followed with Master. Swamiji became a disciple of Yogananda 1 week after reading Autobiography of a Yogi in 1948. When Swamiji read Autobiography of a Yogi, none of what was described in there was familiar to him, but he had an intuitive and total recognition of who Master was and who Master was to Swamiji. So he accepted him as a guru and pledged himself as a disciple without having a real clear idea of what that might entail, and having even less of an understanding of the entire philosophical underpinning of the path of self-realization that he was embracing. So many times, Swamiji said, literally, especially in the first months, he said he would actually become dizzy and would have to just sort of sit down and kind of gather his wits about him because of the extraordinary window onto a completely new concept of the world that Master was opening to him. But Swamiji was a very strong-minded man, 22 years old, but still quite determined and capable in his own right. And so he simply wasn't able to say, yes, sir, Master, if you say so. But nor was he able, because of his intuitive commitment and his faith in Master, to say, oh, come on, that can't be true. So as he put it, I followed Master unhesitatingly, but not unquestioningly. And it's a very subtle nuance that is well worth meditating on, because what he's talking about, and it's worth its relevance, let me expand upon it for a moment. Yesterday in a class I was giving, the same subject came up. The entire key to the spiritual path is us, is each individual being able to act according to the integrity of our own destiny. Most people in the world never separate themselves from mass consciousness. I remember before I ever traveled in the world, Swamiji being a citizen of the world, I remember him talking about being in Europe and seeing all the different European countries represented in various places, meeting citizens from many countries. And in Europe, there would be very few, if any, facial characteristics, physical characteristics that would define, that would make an Israeli look separate, from an Italian, or an Italian different from a Scandinavian, some, but not that many. But Swamiji asserted that he could always tell, or almost always tell, what country a person was from, even before they spoke. He said because they simply emanated the thought form of their upbringing. They were a product of the surrounding world, and they just expressed it. I was very skeptical until I began to travel, and I would be somewhere and I would see a group of people from England coming in. There was just no question about it. Or there are the Russians, and those people must be from Italy. There's just no doubt about it, because it's an aura that you could sense. But the relevant point was, Swami said, but every so often you would meet someone and you had no idea what culture they came from, because they were acting entirely and only from their point of origin, their divine point of origin, and they were entirely themselves. That's what the word original means, is that we act from our point of origin. So as devotees, as people who are living in a material world, in an extremely materialistic age, and in our particular culture, virtually an atheistic age, in which material success is, if there is, insofar as there is a religion, that's our religion, to actually separate ourselves out from that massive thought form and take an entirely different path within ourselves requires a degree of confidence in our own intuition that is really the fundamental first step on the spiritual path. So for Swamiji to be able to unhesitatingly follow Master meant that it was his perception that made that possible. There was no, he wasn't imprisoned, he wasn't forced, he wasn't starved or beaten into that obedience. It was willingly given because Swamiji knew. And many of the tests, many of the challenges that are offered to us on the spiritual path come down exactly to that. What is the basis of my faith? And how powerful am I in being able to hold to it? In the second half of the 90s, all through the 1990s, Ananda was under attack through litigation. And the litigation was first a dispute between what I would call the first church of self-realization and the second church of self-realization, Ananda being the second church of self-realization. All through American history, that's how it's always been. We found churches, there's the first church of, at some point there's a breakaway, and then there's the second church of. And usually the first church of attacks the second church of for being a heretic. And it used to be, in the old days, they would imprison you and torture you. You know, now you just go to court. So we went to court for 12 years, actually. And when religious monopoly didn't succeed, because it's against the American Constitution, character assassination was the next step. So a woman trumped up a case against Ananda and described us and Swami Kriyananda as being guilty of, well, just make a list. It was literally a lawsuit that was a boilerplate lawsuit that had been used against other cults, and our name was just dropped in and out. In a few places, they actually didn't substitute it, so it was obvious what the court that had been before. We made a very serious mistake, very serious, which proved catastrophic in the end in terms of the verdict, because it was so preposterous we didn't believe it would gain any traction. Very serious error. Not accurate perception of human nature. So that's all that. So that lawsuit took place over in the Redwood City courtroom and was almost every day on the front page of the Palo Alto Daily, which was just getting underway and had this great case against the cult in our midst. So people naturally ask questions. And I was in the middle of the legal process. I was part of the legal team. And so people would come and ask me, what's going on? We didn't really have a choice, but full disclosure always seemed to me like a really good idea. Since it's on the front page of the paper anyway, I don't think silence was going to serve us. But full disclosure, I figure if I can handle it, anybody can handle it. But the issue became, and it was very interesting to me, I would have to ask people, why are you interested in Ananda at all? Why do you like it? What is the basis of your belief? What's the basis of your commitment? What's your experience? Because certainly I'm a very persuasive person, you might have noticed that. I can be exceedingly compelling in my rational description. I can give you all the backstory and the front story and the future story and the yesterday story, and I can just overwhelm you with facts and ideas. In other words, I can persuade. But if you can be persuaded by me, you can be persuaded just as easily on the opposite side when the next person comes. Because it simply doesn't serve us to blow with the wind. Especially in matters where our spiritual destiny is at stake. We must stand on ground that belongs to us and is unshakably our own. And most of the challenges to our spiritual life, no matter what they may look like, actually come down to that. They come down to that, what is the basis for your belief and how strong is it? In the end of Jesus' life, he started telling his disciples to eat my body and drink my blood. And in the Bible it says, I love this. And now see, I like to think of this as real. You all have been coming here, many of you for years. What if I just start giving you some preposterous, you all must now shave your head and wear your clothes backwards and give up your automobiles and walk barefoot down the street. Okay, and I don't explain anything about why. I just say that's what you have to do now. I mean, that's about what it sounded like when Jesus said, eat my body and drink my blood. And I love this in the Bible. The disciples said one to another, this is a hard teaching. I mean, it was so real. Sometimes we forget that these are real people having real experiences. If I said really goofy things, you might kind of get away from me and say, this is a hard teaching. I think I'm going to find another church, which is what a lot of the disciples did. From that point, many walked with him no more. There was an exodus. Now, Jesus did that on purpose. And Swami said that Master told him that at the end of Master's life, he also started making it more difficult for his disciples because he knew he was about to leave. And he was able to carry them, but he knew that in the future, their karma was with him and they were going to go their own way. The organization needed to have enough integrity to be able to continue. And Master knew that many of those weaker elements could not be left there. Now, for Jesus, it was far worse because he knew that he was going to leave and that this terrible fear and persecution was going to start, and the disciples would have to be extremely strong and unified in order to carry on afterwards. So Jesus had to winnow out those who were going to have the capacity to do that compared to those who wouldn't. Because it would have been impossible for those disciples to hold what they had to hold if even in their own midst people were waffling. So he needed to move them out. It wasn't for lack of love, it was just the karmic cycle that was necessary. So when a lot of people are leaving, Jesus meets Peter. And you see, over time, all of these characters get flattened out. I don't mean they get flattened out, they become two-dimensional. The actual experience that they have becomes non-human. We have to see it as it really was. The words in the Bible are very simple. Jesus says to Peter, "Are you also going to leave me?" And the context of that isn't given, but you can imagine it. You know, they're sitting down to dinner, and there used to be 45, and now there's 20. You know, there used to be 15, and now there's 3. So he looks to Peter and says, what about you? But Peter doesn't answer with any knowledge of what it means to eat my body and drink my blood. He doesn't have a Catholic ritual. He doesn't have Master's mystical interpretation of Christ consciousness in Om. He has nothing. Jesus is suddenly saying something incomprehensible to him. So Peter can't say, "Oh, I understand." All he says is, "Where would I go?" Now think about the phrase, "Where would I go?" Where would I go means I have no other reality but you. How could I get away from you? Why would I get away from you? Who would I be without you? Unhesitatingly is how he responded. I belong to you. And that's how he was able to weather the storm, because Peter, of course, became quite fearful when Jesus was arrested. And as it says in the Bible, 3 times Peter denied that he was even a disciple. In the midst of all this chaos and all this, Peter had sworn his loyalty, but fear overtook him. But underneath that was this unhesitating commitment as a disciple. So, of course, he made it up later. Because his whole being was not committed to the weak Peter that he was. His whole being was to his potential as a disciple and the promise that Christ had given him. Now, this is what we're all working with. We're all working with this sort of, the spiritual path is so messy. When I started early, now literally almost 50 years ago on this, I thought it was going to be so tidy. I thought there was just this sort of pile of faults, and I would just work through them, like this, like that. Now there's 25, now there's 24, now there's 23, now there's 22, and it just would sort itself out. And it would be a more or less linear process because that's just how things work. I start on the left, I end up on the right, and there we all are. Instead, it just turned into, the only word I can think of is chaos. Just chaos, mental chaos, emotional chaos, karmic chaos, circumstantial chaos. It's just chaos. And there's a Peanuts, the Charles Schulz Peanuts cartoon. I'm of an age now where images that are just so common to my life are incomprehensible, to half the world. This is something writers have to be very careful about. A writing teacher at Princeton actually gave a list of 100 images that were commonly used and asked his millennials to see how many they recognized. 25%, right? So in the Charles Schulz Peanuts cartoon, which used to be a defining reality in my life, there's a character called Pigpen. And Pigpen's nature is that he's kind of messy. These are supposed to be children, and some children are inherently messy and some are not. And my favorite Pigpen cartoon, it's just 4 panels of Pigpen. He's just sitting there. He's not doing anything. Every drawing of him is the same. He's clean, he begins to get messy, he gets messier and messier, and by the end he's, as he usually is, completely covered with chaos. That's the spiritual path. You just sit there. You just sit there, and your karma unravels around you, just like this. And some days, you stay up all night praying with Jesus. And it never crosses your mind to be tired. Never. It's just like this is effortless, and you think, 24, 23, 22, I'm really getting there. And then the next time you're sitting with Swami in India in a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and you have to crawl behind the couch and go to sleep. It's like, what? Where does this come from? And what happens in a very strange way, and I can only say, think about it, meditate on it, is that we gradually realize how many dimensions we're living on at the same time, and how little, how unimportant the one that we think of as the most important actually is. Our thoughts, our feelings. Someone recently found themselves embroiled in a karmic pigpen chaos situation and wrote a very serious request about this and that, and what should I do, and this and that. And by any normal appraisal, it looked important. But I just had to answer honestly, do whatever you want, it doesn't matter. Really. You think your thoughts and feelings and actions really make the difference, but they don't. You do your best, fall asleep, stay awake, do your best. But underneath it, unhesitatingly commit yourself to do your best to follow God's will. Because this little self just comes and goes and comes and goes and comes and goes. How many little selves have we had? When one of my friends was in the last days of her life, just lying there, letting go of her karma and trying to let go of her body, she said to a friend, she said, as I lie here, she said, I see, not hundreds, thousands of faces going before me. And every one of them has been a full lifetime of my own. So it's a little hard, she said, lying here to be real concerned about the face I'm wearing now. Like, how many faces have I worn? How many disappointments and successes have I had? But what really matters at the end of it is who we are with God. Where would I go? Where would I go? Swamiji was asked once, what is the defining factor of success or failure on the spiritual path? And among many answers, several answers that he gave, was to realize that there is no alternative. It's a life or death matter, meaning death is to give up and life is to persevere. And to persevere, in the context of where we started talking about God's will versus our own will, to persevere is to hold our own selves lightly. And that's what the Bhagavad Gita lays out when it talks about all these qualities: openness, truthfulness, humility, disinclination for the world, all of these things, to just hold ourselves lightly. We're not able to put ourselves down completely, but to hold myself, but to hold myself and all my preferences is just gossamer. Just gossamer over the reality of the bedrock of my commitment to God. And to recognize with perfect comfort, even the disciples of Jesus couldn't stay awake and pray with him. Even at such a moment, human will fails. But God's will never fails. If in the end, after all the chaos is settled, or as soon as we can in the midst of the chaos, we can say simply, well, if it's come to me, it must be God's will. And if it's God's will, why am I afraid? Oh, I have lots of reasons why am I afraid. But really, in the end, why am I afraid? Just ask and answer that question over and over again. And we will live for eternity in the light. God bless you.
Lord, let this cup pass from me. Let my heart not know so much pain. Must the love thou bearest thy children ever suffer such disdain? Would that I might reveal thy greatness, nevertheless thy will be done. Lord, let this cup pass from me. Let my heart not know so much pain. Must the love thou bearest thy children ever suffer such disdain? Would that I might reveal thy greatness, nevertheless thy will be done. Thy will, thy will, thy will be done. All that I am is thine. all that I am. Nothing of man endures wonder or scorn. Birth, life, and death are one, veils of thy love. Thy will, thy will, thy will alone. All that I've done is thine. All